Welcome back to Nightfall Notions, where we unravel the quiet, peculiar, and often overlooked tales of history, one drowsy thought at a time. If you enjoy stories that meander through the absurd and the mundane, consider subscribing for more. Tonight, we delve into the first chapter of G.D. Village Herald, a job nobody wanted, a tale that explores why this role was the least coveted position in any self-respecting medieval settlement. Chapter 1. The Village Herald, a job nobody wanted. In the small, perpetually damp village of Wixbury, nestled between a river that flooded every spring and a forest that smelled inexplicably of burnt toast, there existed a job so dreadful that even the most desperate souls hesitated to take it. This was the role of the village herald, a position that required neither skill nor strength, only an unshakable tolerance for humiliation and a voice that could outlast a sermon. The herald's duties were simple in theory, but torturous in practice. Every morning, without fail, he was to stand in the town square, a patch of mud generously referred to as such, and announce the day's news to a crowd that consisted primarily of disinterested chickens and a lone, half-deaf cooper who mistook the announcements for personal greetings. The news itself was rarely noteworthy. Most days it consisted of updates like "Old Thaddeus' cow is still missing," or "The alewife promises this batch won't cause blindness," delivered with the gravity of a royal decree. The real problem, however, wasn't the content of the announcements. It was the villagers themselves. Wixbury's residents had perfected the art of ignoring the herald with a dedication that bordered on reverence. Children mimicked his every word in sing-song mockery. Women hanging laundry would pause only to sigh dramatically before shutting their windows. Even the livestock seemed to conspire against him. Geese hissed, goats chewed on the hem of his tunic, and the village's single, melancholic donkey would bray in what could only be interpreted as critique. The previous herald, a gaunt man named Edwin, who had taken the job after a tragic misunderstanding involving a bet and a barrel of mead, lasted precisely 11 days before he was found whispering his resignation into a well. When asked why he was quitting, he simply pointed to a group of children who were reenacting his announcements with exaggerated despair, complete with a fake limp and a straw hat that kept falling off. "I'd rather shovel pig dung," he muttered, and the village, lacking volunteers, briefly considered training a pig for the role instead. But the true horror of the herald's existence wasn't the ridicule or the futility. It was the inevitability of becoming the bearer of bad news. Sooner or later, the herald would have to announce something truly unpleasant, a tax increase, a plague warning, or the dreaded "The Earl's son is visiting, so hide your daughters and your good cutlery." These were the moments when the villagers finally paid attention, only to direct their collective fury at the messenger. Stones were thrown. Rotten vegetables were lobbed with surprising accuracy. Once a herald had to outrun a butcher wielding a sausage like a club, all because he'd relayed that the annual fair was cancelled due to an outbreak of head lice. And so, the position remained perpetually vacant, passed around like a cursed relic. The village elders, in their infinite wisdom, tried everything to fill it. They offered extra rations, a slightly less leaky roof for the herald's hut, and even the dubious honor of sitting at the head table during feasts, where the herald would inevitably be asked to repeat every announcement for the drunk and forgetful lord. Nothing worked. The job was, in every sense, a punishment, one that no amount of mead or meager compensation could sweeten. Yet, as Wixbury's luck would have it, the role would soon fall to the most unlikely candidate of all, a man who didn't even want it. But that, of course, is a story for another night. Chapter 2. The First Bad News, a Herald's Curse. It was an unspoken rule in Wixbury, as immutable as the rain in spring, or the way old Nan's bread could double as a doorstop. The village herald was cursed. Not cursed in the dramatic, lightning strikes twice sense, but cursed in the slow, grinding way that turned men into walking superstitions. The moment someone took up the horn and stood in the square to announce anything more dire than the weather, the villagers would nod sagely and say, "Aye, there it is. The curse has him now." The origins of this belief were murky, but most agreed it began with poor Gilbert the Unlucky, a man so inept at avoiding misfortune that even his shadow seemed to trip over itself. Gilbert had been Wixbury's herald for less than a week before his first and last truly bad announcement. The day had started normally enough. He cleared his throat, adjusted his hat, a pointless gesture given the wind's fondness for stealing it, and declared that the harvest festival would feature an extra keg of ale. The villagers, for once, had perked up. Then, like a man stepping on his own cloak mid-bow, Gilbert added, "Also, the miller's son fell into the gristmill. They're still scraping him off the stones." Silence. Then chaos. The miller, who had been cheerfully mending a sack nearby, let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a battle cry. The crowd, moments ago buoyant with the promise of free ale, now looked at Gilbert as if he'd personally fed the boy into the gears. By sundown, the story had twisted into something even worse. Gilbert had degaussed the accident by announcing it, as if the words themselves had summoned the tragedy. After that, no herald could deliver ill tidings without the villagers muttering about curses. The superstition only grew with time. When Agnes the fishwife's entire stock of eels went belly up the day after the herald mentioned a strange smell near the creek, it was the curse. When the blacksmith's forge collapsed under the weight of its own soot, just hours after the herald casually observed, "That chimney looks crooked," it was definitely the curse. Never mind that the chimney had been one strong breeze away from toppling for years. The herald had even spoken of it, and so the herald was to blame. By the time Bartholomew the Weary took up the role, no one remembered his real name. He had earned the epithet within a day. The curse had become self-fulfilling. The villagers now expected disaster whenever the herald spoke, and so disaster followed. Bartholomew once made the mistake of announcing that the well water tasted odd. By noon, 3 people had sworn they were dying of poison. The baker had fainted dramatically into a trough, and the village cats were staging what looked like a coordinated protest near the now avoided well. The water, as it turned out, had always tasted faintly of mushrooms. But the curse had struck again. The worst part was how the heralds themselves started to believe it. They'd shuffle into the square with the air of men heading to the gallows, their voices growing quieter with each grim proclamation, as if volume might soften the blow. Some took to whispering the bad news, which only made the villagers lean in closer, ears straining, thus ensuring the words lodged in their minds like splinters. Others tried to bury the ill tidings between cheerful updates, a tactic that backfired spectacularly when one herald sandwiched, "The plague inspector is coming," between "fresh eggs for sale" and "the ducklings have hatched." The ducklings, for the record, did not survive the week, and so the heralds of Wixbury became less messengers and more human lightning rods for misfortune, their presence alone enough to make the villagers flinch. Children would scatter when they approached, as if bad news were contagious. Lovers would pause mid-whisper, fearing the herald might overhear and accidentally announce their secret betrothal. A sure way to doom it. Even the rats seemed to avoid them, which, given Wixbury's rodent population, was perhaps the greatest testament to the curse's power. But curses, like most things in Wixbury, were subject to interpretation. What if the heralds weren't cursed to bring bad news, but simply to be the ones who noticed it first? What if the village's collective dread was the real curse, a self-inflicted wound dressed up as superstition? These were questions no one asked, of course. It was easier to blame the herald. And so the cycle continued, each new bearer of the horn stepping into the role with the grim certainty that sooner or later the curse would find him. The only mystery was what form it would take next. A failed crop, a sudden gout outbreak, a traveling bard with an off-key lute and a fondness for singing after midnight, Whatever it was, the herald would be there to announce it, and inevitably to bear the brunt of the villagers' ire. But deep down, beneath the layers of resigned misery and the occasional bruise from a well-aimed turnip, the heralds knew the truth. The real curse wasn't the bad news. It was the fact that, in a village determined to shoot the messenger, someone always had to stand in the square and play target. Chapter 3. The Art of Yelling Unpleasant Things. To the untrained observer, the role of village herald might seem simple. Stand in the square, open one's mouth, and project words into the general vicinity of human ears. But the heralds of Wixbury knew better. Announcing the mundane was one thing. Delivering bad news was an art form, requiring a delicate balance of volume, timing, and strategic retreat routes. Take taxes, for example. A simple thing. Taxes, necessary, inevitable, universally despised. But the moment the herald uttered the words, tax assessment, the air itself seemed to recoil. Over the years, Wixbury's heralds had developed an entire taxonomy of tax-announcing techniques. There was the hasty mumble, where the herald rattled off the rates in one breath before anyone could process them, then immediately followed up with something distracting like, also, the baker's cat had kittens. This rarely worked. There was the deflective complimenton, as employed by Harold Oswin, who once prefaced a tax hike with, "Good people of Wixbury," looking especially robust today. No doubt due to your thriving livelihoods, which, incidentally, will now be slightly. The villagers had not taken it well. Then there was the plague. Plague announcements required a special touch, a tone that conveyed urgency without inciting full-blown panic. Or worse, the kind of opportunistic looting that inevitably followed the phrase, highly contagious. The most skilled heralds could turn a death sentence into something almost poetic. Harold Alaric, may he rest in peace, preferably not from the plague, had once delivered the news with such solemn gravitas that half the village mistook it for a particularly depressing weather report. "A shadow creeps upon our homes," he intoned, "not of clouds, but of pestilence. Also, it might rain." By the time the villagers realized what he meant, he had already fled to the next town. But the true test of a herald's skill was the dramatic pause. This was the breath between the setup and the blow, the moment when the entire village leaned in, hearts pounding, only to regret it immediately. Harold Godric, a man with the unfortunate habit of smiling during bad news, had mastered this technique. "Good people," he would begin, grinning as if about to announce free mead for all. "I bring joyous tidings of—" Pause for effect, while the villagers dared to hope. "Our beloved Lord's decision to double the wool tithe." The ensuing silence was usually broken by the sound of someone throwing a shoe. Of course, not all bad news was created equal. Some required a lighter touch, the ease often blowy. When the herald had to inform the village that the annual fair was cancelled due to an outbreak of head lice, he might phrase it as, "The fair shall be postponed until such time as our scalps are less lively." When the miller's prize pig escaped and was last seen heading for the river with what appeared to be purposeful intent, the herald could diplomatically note, "The miller requests assistance in locating his esteemed swine, who has embarked upon an unexpected journey of self-discovery." There was, however, one announcement so universally dreaded that no amount of rhetorical finesse could soften it. The arrival of the Earl's tax collector. This particular brand of misery had to be delivered with the blunt force of a hammer to the skull. No pauses, no poetry, just the cold, hard facts barked at maximum volume before the herald ducked behind the nearest solid object. The tax collector arrives at noon, was typically followed by the sound of shutters slamming, doors bolting, and at least one person pretending to be dead in the street. The heralds themselves paid a steep physical toll for their craft. Years of projecting over crowd noise and occasional projectiles left their voices raspy and their throats perpetually raw. Many took to sucking on honeyed lozenges, a habit that only made them resemble guilt-ridden children with stolen sweets. Others developed strange, performative coughs, a handy way to buy time before delivering particularly nasty updates. Ahem, cough, terrible business is cough, almost as terrible as, say, the news that the winter grain stores have rotted. By the time a herald retired, if he lived that long, his voice bore the scars of his office, a gravelly, weather-beaten thing that sounded less like speech and more like two rocks being ground together. Former heralds could often be found in the tavern, sipping ale in sullen silence while their replacements suffered in the square. Occasionally one would raise a toast to the poor soul currently shouting about another failed harvest, their voices carrying across the village like a grim echo. Welcome to the curse, Anikati. But for all its miseries, the art of yelling unpleasant things had its own strange dignity. But Herald didn't just deliver bad news. He shaped it, softened its edges, sometimes even made it bearable. And though the villagers would never admit it, there was a certain comfort in knowing that no matter how awful the tidings, someone would always be there to shout them into the wind, louder than the geese, more persistent than the rain, and far braver than anyone had any right to expect. Chapter 4. Heralds versus Angry Mobs. A losing battle. History, if it remembers heralds at all, tends to portray them as faceless criers, background noise to the grand events they announced. But the heralds of Wixbury knew better. To stand before a crowd and speak words that would inevitably summon fury was to understand history in its rawest form, as a series of bad decisions where someone had to be the first to get hit with a rotten cabbage. The relationship between heralds and angry mobs was as old as the profession itself. The moment a herald cleared his throat to announce anything more controversial than the weather, the atmosphere in Wixbury Square would shift palpably. Shoulders tensed. Hands crept toward whatever was nearby and vaguely throwable. Vegetables, clumps of mud, once even a bewildered chicken that had been plucked mid-air by an overzealous cooper. It wasn't personal. It wasn't even really about the message. It was simply that someone had to bear the brunt of collective frustration, and the herald was conveniently already standing there. Some heralds tried strategy. Herald Oswin, ever the optimist, believed that if he delivered bad news while holding a large loaf of bread, the villagers might be too distracted by carbohydrates to riot. This worked exactly once, when the news was merely that the well would be closed for cleaning. The next week, when he attempted the same tactic while announcing a new tax on milling, the bread was promptly stolen and used as ammunition against him. Others relied on speed. A wise herald learned to gauge the exact moment a crowd's murmurs tipped from displeased to dangerous, at which point the correct maneuver was to drop the scroll and run before the first projectile left someone's hand. Harold Goldrick, who had survived 3 separate stints in the role, a record he attributed to fast legs and faster apologies, had perfected the art of the tactical retreat. His signature move involved concluding each announcement with "That is all," shouted over his shoulder as he dove behind the dubious safety of the town's only market stall. The stall's owner, a perpetually bemused woman named Agnes, eventually began charging him protection fees in the form of mead. But speed wasn't always enough. Some announcements were simply too inflammatory to outrun. When the Earl decreed that all unmarried women over 20 would be assessed an additional spinster tax, a policy that lasted exactly as long as it took for his wife to hear about it, the herald tasked with announcing it barely made it 2 steps before being engulfed by a wave of furious villagers. Half of them women wielding rolling pins, the other half men. The herald was last seen fleeing into the woods, pursued by what later became known as the only spontaneous women's march in Wixbury's history. He returned 3 days later, covered in bramble scratches and with a new appreciation for celibacy. Then there were the subtler dangers. Not the explosive rage of mobs, but the slow-burning grudges that turned entire villages against a herald for weeks. A poorly delivered announcement about spoiled ale could result in months of tavern-goers accidentally bumping into the herald until he developed a permanent lien. A proclamation about mandatory church attendance might earn the herald a front-row pew every Sunday, where the priest could fix him with pointed stares about sloth and moral decay. Even minor offenses, like mispronouncing someone's name during a birth announcement, could result in years of petty revenge, missing mail, mysteriously underweight bread loaves, or the inexplicable appearance of snails in one's shoes. The worst punishment, however, wasn't violence or ostracism. It was mimicry. Nothing cut a herald deeper than hearing his own words parodied back at him by children in the street. A particularly unfortunate herald named Edwin, no relation to the well-whisperer from Chapter 1, had once announced a new law against public drunkenness with such pompous solemnity that within hours the village urchins were trailing behind him, imitating his nasal inflection while pretending to stagger. Hear ye, they crowed. All citizens must each conduct themselves with Belsh dignity henceforth. Edwin lasted only 2 more days before resigning to become a hermit, or at least a man who only shouted at squirrels. By the time a herald had weathered a few mobs, he developed a sixth sense for impending trouble. The way the air grew thick before the first shout. The way hands flexed before grabbing rocks. The way someone in the back always started chanting something inflammatory just loud enough to catch on. Veterans could predict riots the way sailors predicted storms, by the pressure in their bones and the taste of metal in their mouths. Yet for all the dangers, there was an unspoken code among Wixbury's heralds. You never abandoned your post mid-announcement. No matter how ominous the gathering crowd, no matter how creatively the villagers were arming themselves, a herald stood his ground until the last word was spoken. It wasn't bravery so much as professional pride. After all, if you were going to get pelted with produce, you might as well earn it. And so the heralds persisted, season after season, dodging more produce than a market stall, and developing the reflexes of over-caffeinated cats. They became students of human anger, cataloging its many flavors. The hot, spitting rage of farmers told their crops were being requisitioned. The cold, calculating fury of merchants informed of new tariffs, the bewildered indignation of villagers learning that, no, the Earl would not be repealing the law that required everyone to. In the end, the heralds understood something the mobs did not. Fury was temporary, but announcements were forever. Long after the last vegetable had been thrown and the last insult hurled, the words remained, settling into the village's memory like stones in a riverbed. And the next morning, no matter how bruised or cabbage-scented, the herald would return to the square, unfold his scroll, and begin again. Chapter 5. The Royal Messenger's Dirty Secret. The nobles called it statecraft. The heralds called it what it was, being fed to wolves while someone else whistled innocently from a safe distance. For all the abuse village heralds endured, their royal counterparts suffered a more insidious fate, not merely delivering bad news, but becoming the living shields between displeased populations and the lords who actually deserved their anger. This arrangement worked splendidly for everyone except the heralds. Kings and earls had long ago realized that while peasants might grumble about taxes or conscription, they reserved their true fury for the unfortunate soul who announced such policies. A wise ruler understood that the more elaborately dressed the messenger, the less likely anyone would remember who actually issued the decree. Thus was born the time-honored tradition of royal heralds being sent out in absurdly ornate tabards, their outfits so heavy with embroidery and gilt that they practically screamed, "Look at me, not at the man who signed the order." The system reached its apotheosis in Wixbury, when the Earl, a man whose grasp of economics rivaled that of a concussed pigeon, decided to solve his latest financial woes by imposing a tax on children. Not a tax for having children. That would have been merely cruel. No, This was a tax on the children themselves, assessed by height and payable in grain or labor. Even by medieval standards, this was impressively stupid. The Earl's chamberlain, upon hearing the plan, developed a sudden cough that required immediate bed rest. The steward claimed to have pressing business inspecting some walls very far away, which left the task of announcing this masterpiece of governance to the Earl's personal herald, a once proud man named Reginald, whose job had reduced him to the approximate emotional resilience of a wrung-out dish rag. Reginald knew what was coming. He'd been through this dance before. The Earl would dream up some new way to alienate his subjects, and Reginald would be thrust into the square to take the consequences. Last time, it had been the infamous mustache tariff that nearly sparked a rebellion among the village's more hirsute men. The time before that, it had been the short-lived but deeply resented laughter license that required citizens to purchase permits for public merriment. The Earl had argued that excessive joviality was distracting peasants from their work. In reality, he was just a miserable bastard who hated hearing people enjoy themselves. So when Reginald unrolled the scroll announcing the child tax, he did so with the air of a man stepping onto a gallows. He'd taken precautions, of course. He'd worn his most ceremonial tabard, the one with so much gold thread it could probably stop an arrow, and positioned himself near the town's only exit. He even practiced what he hoped was a disarming smile, though years of bad news had left his facial muscles capable of producing only a grimace that vaguely resembled a man smelling bad cheese. None of it helped. The moment the words "all children above 3 hands high" left his mouth, the square erupted in a cacophony of outrage that would have been impressive had it not been directed entirely at him. Women waved distaffs like battle standards. Men brandished farming implements with worrying specificity. Someone's grandmother threw a wooden clog with shocking accuracy, striking Reginald square in the chest with a thud that reverberated through his ribcage. "Now, good people," Reginald began, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a placating gesture rather than the instinctual flinch it actually was. "Get him!" screamed the baker, whose 8 children currently constituted nearly half his net worth. What followed wasn't so much a riot as a highly motivated foot race, with Reginald as the prey and approximately 70% of Wixbury's adult population as the hunters. He made it approximately 300 paces before being cornered near the tannery, a location that offered the dual disadvantages of terrible smells and plentiful buckets of foul-smelling liquids just begging to be thrown. As Reginald cowered behind an overturned cart, his beautiful tabard now ruined by something that might have been urine or might have been a particularly aggressive vinegar, it occurred to him that there was something fundamentally unjust about his predicament. The Earl was warm in his castle, probably enjoying a nice roast and laughing about the whole affair, while Reginald was about to die in a puddle of substances he didn't want to identify. This realization birthed in Reginald something dangerous. An idea. When the mob finally dragged him before the village council, largely because no one could agree on what exactly to do with him, Reginald did something no royal herald had ever dared. He told the truth. "The Earl came up with this," he gasped, clutching his bruised ribs. "I'm just the idiot who reads the words. If you're going to hang someone, at least hang the right nobleman." The silence that followed was so profound that even the chickens stopped clucking. In that moment, Reginald understood the real reason heralds were so carefully dressed and so thoroughly abused. They were never just messengers. They were sacrifices, human lightning rods meant to draw fury away from those in power. The more elaborate the uniform, the more obvious the target. The more abuse the herald endured, the less the ruler had to. To everyone's shock, especially Reginald's, the villagers listened. More shockingly still, they marched en masse to the Earl's castle, where an impromptu delegation, armed with farm tools and a very persuasive blacksmith, explained in vivid terms why taxing children was a poor life choice. The tax was rescinded by sundown. Reginald expected to be executed for insubordination. Instead, he found himself quietly dismissed. The Earl couldn't risk keeping around a herald who'd proven capable of redirecting peasant anger where it belonged. Stripped of his gilded tabard, and with no marketable skills beyond loud proclamation and dodging produce, Reginald did the only sensible thing. He walked straight to Wicksbury's tavern and drank until the memory of his former life blurred into something resembling amusement. Back at the castle, the Earl's council debated how to prevent future such incidents. Their solution was both predictable and telling. From that day forward, all royal heralds would be chosen from among the most illiterate, dim-witted men available, the kind who couldn't improvise if their lives depended on it. The system, after all, depended on heralds being disposable. As for Reginald, he eventually found work as a town crier in a neighboring village, where his tendency to add editorial comments like this one's "really the mayor's idea, don't shoot me" made him surprisingly popular. He died peacefully in his sleep years later, a minor local celebrity, and, if the stories are to be believed, with a satisfied smirk permanently etched on his face. The moral, if there was one, was this: the quickest way to undermine an unjust system is to point out exactly who deserves the tomatoes, especially if they're currently hiding behind a castle wall. Chapter 6. The Herald's Guide to Survival. Survival, as a medieval herald, required skills not listed in any official job description. Yes, one needed a strong voice and basic literacy. But far more crucial was the ability to read a crowd's mood, to spot the precise moment when general grumbling turned into projectile-hurling rage, and most importantly to know which villagers had the best throwing arms. Martha the brewer never missed. God rest her soul. Over generations, Wicksbury's heralds developed an unspoken manual for avoiding bodily harm, a collection of hard-won wisdom passed down like a sacred text. If sacred text contained advice like never turn your back on a fisherman holding a dead carp, the first rule of herald survival was simple: never make eye contact with angry people. This lesson had been etched into heraldic lore after the unfortunate incident of 1273, when Herald Oswin accidentally locked eyes with a blacksmith while announcing a new iron tax. The resulting thrown hammer not only cracked Oswin's collarbone, but embedded itself so deeply in the announcement post that it remained there for years as a grim warning to future heralds. Experienced criers developed a 1,000-yard stare that focused on some distant point just above the crowd's heads, giving the impression of solemn dignity while actually watching for incoming vegetables in their peripheral vision. Seasoned heralds knew the importance of strategic positioning. The town square might seem like the natural place for announcements, but smart criers chose their ground carefully. Never stand downwind unless you enjoyed smelling like rotten eggs for a week. Never position yourself near the butcher's stall unless you wanted to risk slipping on offal during your escape. The ideal spot was near the well. Not only did it provide a psychological association with purity and truth, useful when lying about the Earl's intentions, but in a pinch one could claim sudden well inspection duties as an excuse to leave quickly. Timing was everything. Announce tax increases right before lunch when people were distracted by hunger. Deliver plague notices in the morning when everyone was still too sleepy for proper outrage. The worst possible time was late afternoon, when villagers had finished their day's work, but hadn't yet drunk enough ale to become pleasantly numb to bad news. Harold Godfrey had learned this the hard way, when he announced a new levy on hops at sunset, and spent the next week picking barley out of his hair. The clothing choices of veteran heralds reflected centuries of practical experience. While royal messengers might wear elaborate tabards that made them look like gilded targets, Wicksbury's smarter criers favored layers, lots of layers. A thick wool cloak could soften the blow of a well-thrown turnip. Loose-fitting tunics allowed quick removal if someone dumped a bucket of slops on you, a favorite protest method among dairy farmers. Some heralds took to wearing wide-brimmed hats not for fashion, but because they provided makeshift shields against airborne refuse. After the great cabbage incident of 1312, one innovative herald began carrying an actual small buckler, which the villagers allowed because it made the whole business more sporting. Language mattered almost as much as defensive gear. The difference between his lordship demands higher taxes and his lordship humbly requests your generous support in these trying times could mean the difference between keeping your teeth and swallowing them. Euphemisms were a herald's best friend. A temporary hardship sounded better than famine, just as enhanced patriotic contribution went down smoother than confiscation of your grain. Some heralds developed entire vocabularies of softening phrases, their announcements becoming masterpieces of obfuscation that would make a lawyer weep with pride. When forced to deliver truly terrible news, the wisest criers employed the sandwich method. One piece of bad news nestled between two neutral or even positive items. The spring festival is postponed due to concerns about contagion, but the good news is Martha's famous meat pies will still be available, and also the Earl has decided to pardon 3 prisoners. Unrelated to the contagion, probably. Experienced heralds kept mental maps of every escape route in the village. They knew which fences were loose enough to squeeze through, which alleys led to dead ends, and which back gardens contained particularly territorial geese. Harold Edric once escaped an angry mob by diving through Widow Clement's chicken coop, a move that cost him some dignity but saved him several teeth. They also memorized which villages might offer sanctuary. The kindly midwife who disapproved of violence, the perpetually drunk cooper, who found riots amusing, or the schoolmaster who could always be counted on to lecture an angry crowd about proper civic behavior until the energy dissipated. Perhaps the most important survival skill was learning to distinguish between different types of anger. There was the performative rage, lots of shouting and dramatic gestures but little actual danger. There was the sullen, simmering displeasure that might result in later sabotage but wouldn't cause immediate harm. And then there was the cold, quiet fury that meant you should already be running. Veteran heralds could read these moods in the set of shoulders, the way hands curled or didn't curl into fists, even in the particular quality of silence that fell before a proper beating. The smartest ones kept small bribes handy, a flask of good brandy for the blacksmith, a bit of lace for his wife, a sweet for their troublesome child. It wasn't corruption, just sensible risk management. When all else failed, there was always the last resort, the strategic feint. Properly executed, a sudden collapse could turn an angry crowd into a concerned one, especially if accompanied by dramatic clutching at the chest and labored breathing. Harold Baldwin had survived 3 separate tax seasons this way, though he'd eventually been caught practicing his death rattle behind the tavern. Some heralds took to carrying small pouches of pig's blood or beet juice to smear artistically at the corners of their mouths when particularly dire announcements were required. A well-timed feint might not prevent violence entirely, but it could at least ensure the first few blows were delivered with slightly less enthusiasm. The truly great heralds understood that their job wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining the fragile equilibrium between rulers and ruled. A smart herald knew when to soften a lord's harsh words, when to subtly emphasize certain phrases that might make the medicine go down easier, and when to omit particularly inflammatory clauses, always deniable as an unfortunate oversight. The best of them walked the razor's edge between loyalty and self-preservation. Their announcements carefully crafted things that delivered the required message while leaving just enough room for hope, or at least resignation. In the end, every herald developed his own survival strategies, a personal code born of bruises, and near misses and the occasional successful escape. Some favored speed, others misdirection, a few even managed grudging respect through sheer stubborn persistence. But they all shared one unshakable understanding. This wasn't just a job. It was an ongoing battle of wits against an entire population that saw you as the physical embodiment of every bad decision made by people far away and far safer than you. To survive as a herald required equal parts diplomat, psychologist, and sprinter, with just enough theatrics thrown in to keep things interesting. And if all else failed, There was always the ancient Herald's fallback, a good pair of running shoes and an intimate knowledge of every root cellar in town. Chapter 7. The Lonely Life of the Town Crier. There existed in Wixbury a particular bench near the tannery, where the village herald could reliably be found during his few off hours. It wasn't much of a bench, more a collection of half-rotted planks that had somehow avoided being burned for firewood, but it served its purpose. Here the current holder of that dubious honor, a man named Alistair with the shoulders of a defeated ox and the voice of a crow with a head cold, would sit alone methodically chewing whatever food he'd managed to acquire that day while watching children play in the distance. No one ever joined him on that bench. This was by design on all sides. The social ostracism of heralds wasn't immediate or even intentional at first. It simply made sense in the way village logic often did. Why would you befriend someone whose entire job consisted of ruining your day? Why share a pint with a man who might tomorrow announce your sheep were being confiscated? Better to keep a safe distance, to nod politely, but never invite him to supper, to pretend not to notice when he sat alone at Sunday services. Over time, this polite distance hardened into something more formal, more ingrained. Heralds became like bad weather, acknowledged but never welcomed, endured but never embraced. Alistair had known this would happen when he took the job. His predecessor, a wheezing fellow who'd lasted an impressive 6 months before succumbing to what was either pneumonia or sheer existential despair, had warned him. "You'll have 2 friends," the man had croaked on his deathbed, "the silence before you speak, and the echo afterward." At the time, Alistair had assumed this was just the melodrama of a dying man. Now he understood it was simple fact. The tavern was the worst of it. Before becoming herald, Alistair had been a regular at the Tipsy Goose, where he'd enjoyed middling popularity as a man who could hold his ale and tell a decent joke. Now when he entered, conversations hiccuped into awkward silence. The publican still served him, but with the tense air of a man handling something potentially explosive. Once, after a particularly disastrous announcement about grain rationing, Alistair had walked in to find his usual stool occupied by a large sack of turnips. No one had commented. Neither had he. Even the children treated him differently. Where once they'd waved at him with the casual indifference afforded to all unremarkable adults, they now regarded him with a sort of wary curiosity, as if he might at any moment announce that playtime was being taxed, or that all sweets were now property of the Earl. The braver ones sometimes followed him at a distance, mimicking his announcements in exaggerated tones until their mothers called them away, as if prolonged exposure might be contagious. There were exceptions, of course. Old Tom the grave-digger would occasionally share his lunch with Alistair, not out of any particular kindness, but because, as Tom put it, "You'll be announcing my work soon enough. Might as well stay on good terms." The village idiot, a title earned through actual brain damage rather than the honorary version bestowed upon most civic officials, was unfailingly friendly, though this mainly consisted of grinning toothlessly and offering Alistair half-eaten pieces of fruit. And then there was Marjorie, the washerwoman, who once brought him a cup of cider after a particularly ugly announcement about new water fees, though whether this was kindness or professional interest. She did, after all, specialize in removing stains. Remained unclear. The loneliness wore on a man in strange ways. Alistair found himself talking to his reflection in the village well. He'd developed an elaborate system of hand signals with the stray dog that loitered near the smithy, though the dog mostly just wagged its tail when it wanted food. He took to memorizing the exact timbre of different villagers' groans when he announced bad news, ranking them like a sommelier cataloging fine wines. The baker's resigned sigh scored a 7-10 for pathos, while the blacksmith's guttural growl earned top marks for sheer physical menace. Holidays were particularly brutal. During the harvest festival, while villagers danced and drank themselves into cheerful oblivion, Alistair stood off to the side, the human equivalent of a rain cloud. No one wanted to celebrate with the man who'd spent all year telling them everything they couldn't do or couldn't have. Even the Yule celebrations, that great equalizer of medieval society, found Alistair sipping his mulled wine alone near the fire exit, just in case someone remembered who'd announced this year's Yule tax. The cruelest irony was that heralds, of all people, had no one to announce their own misfortunes. When Alistair caught the ague and spent 3 days shivering in his hovel, no town crier came to inform the populace. When his roof collapsed under the weight of an unusually enthusiastic snowfall, he had to repair it himself in between coughing fits. The only acknowledgement of his suffering came from the village's unofficial network of gossip, which spread the news with neither his input nor his embellishments. Perhaps this was why so many heralds developed eccentricities. Old Herald had taken to wearing bells on his hat, ostensibly to enhance his announcements, but really just to fill the silence. Oswin the Younger, no relation to the original Oswin, carried on lengthy debates with his own shadow. And Alistair? Alistair had started composing announcements that would never be delivered, flowery proclamations about the beauty of sunsets, about the particular way light fell through the oak trees west of the village, about how Marjorie the washerwoman's hands moved when she scrubbed its stubborn stain. These he would whisper to the stray dog, who at least never threw anything at him. In quieter moments, Alistair wondered if this isolation wasn't part of the job's design. A herald with friends might soften messages for them. A herald with social standing might hesitate before delivering particularly egregious decrees. Better to keep them lonely, keep them separate, keep them perpetually off balance. A man with nothing to lose made for a more reliable messenger. The bench by the tannery creaked under Alistair's weight as he watched the sun dip below the village roofs. Somewhere, families were gathering for supper. Somewhere, friends were sharing drinks and stories. Somewhere, people were living lives that didn't involve being a walking, talking bearer of misery. Alistair sighed, adjusted his hat against the coming chill, and rose to face another evening of silence. Tomorrow would bring another announcement, another square full of angry faces, another day of being both omnipresent and invisible. As he walked back to his hovel, a child's ball rolled across his path. He picked it up and handed it to the wide-eyed boy who came chasing after it. The child hesitated, then snatched the ball and ran back to his friends without a word. Alistair watched them go, then turned down the alley toward home, his footsteps echoing against the empty walls. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Somewhere even further away, someone laughed. The herald walked on, a man made of words with no one to hear them. Chapter 8. When heralds went on strike. The first sign something was amiss came when the sun rose over Wixbury Square and no herald appeared. This in itself wasn't entirely unusual. Heralds succumbed to illness like anyone else, or occasionally overslept after particularly strong ale the night before. But by midday, when no replacement had arrived to announce the new tax on chimney smoke, a particularly inspired bit of revenue generation by the Earl's Chamberlain, the villagers grew uneasy. Bad news, like bad weather, was at least predictable in its arrival. This silence felt unnatural. The second day dawned with still no herald. The baker's wife claimed to have seen 3 of them drinking together at the Tipsy Goose the previous evening in what appeared to be suspiciously good spirits. The blacksmith reported hearing loud singing from the direction of the herald's communal hovel, a rousing rendition of the Ballad of the Unappreciated Messenger with what sounded like improvised verses about unfair working conditions. By the 3rd day, rumors began circulating that this was no accident. Old Tom the gravedigger swore he'd witnessed a clandestine meeting near the mill pond where heralds from 3 neighboring villages had gathered, speaking in hushed tones and passing around what appeared to be a list of demands written on the back of a tax notice. The document reportedly included such radical notions as not being struck with produce more than twice per announcement and 1 day of rest per 7, not counting when recovering from vegetable-related injuries. The Earl, when informed of this potential insurrection, initially refused to believe it. "They'll turn up," he scoffed, spearing a piece of pheasant with unnecessary violence. "What else are they good for?" But as the week wore on with no official word about the new well-digging levy or the mandatory mustache grooming standards, even the castle staff began noticing the strange quiet. Chaos, as it turned out, was the natural state of affairs without heralds to impose order. Villagers showed up to work on what turned out to be newly declared holidays. Taxes went unpaid simply because no one had been officially informed of them. The Earl's decree banning the color yellow, a personal grudge stemming from an unfortunate incident involving lemon curd in his best doublet, went completely unenforced because only 3 people had heard about it secondhand, and 2 of them were colorblind. The most striking consequence appeared in the marketplace, where the usual rhythms of commerce collapsed under the weight of unconfirmed rumors. Without official pronouncements, every bit of news became suspect. A simple announcement like the miller's wheat is ready spiraled into competing claims about quality, quantity, and whether the miller's daughter had actually seen pixies in the grain. Prices fluctuated wildly based on hearsay. The fishmonger nearly came to blows with the candlemaker over conflicting reports about the week's fasting requirements. Attempts to fill the information gap proved disastrous. The Earl first ordered his guards to make announcements, but their deep voices and intimidating armor made every proclamation sound like a threat, sending villagers scrambling for hiding places. The priest tried reading notices from the church steps, but couldn't resist adding editorial commentary about moral failings, turning even simple market updates into hour-long sermons. A particularly ill-advised experiment with having the Earl's fool deliver news resulted in rhyming couplets about taxation that, while catchy, were factually questionable and dangerously memorable. Meanwhile, the striking heralds had retreated to an abandoned shepherd's hut in the woods where they spent their days playing dice and composing increasingly elaborate ballads about their plight. Herald Alistair, who had somehow become the de facto leader despite protesting that he barely managed to lead himself to breakfast each morning, maintained a list of grievances that grew more specific with each passing day. Item 7. He read aloud by firelight one evening. No announcement requiring the phrase, "by order of his lordship's most glorious and unquestionable wisdom," shall exceed 50 words total. We're messengers, not poets. Back in Wixbury, the social order continued unraveling. Marriages nearly collapsed when bans went unpublished. Traveling merchants accustomed to relying on heralds for local rules and customs accidentally violated 3 different unannounced ordinances before lunch. The village council, forced to make decisions without the framework of official decrees, fell into endless debate about everything from grazing rights to the proper punishment for whistling on Sundays. The breaking point came when the Earl's tax collector arrived to find not a single household prepared with their payments. The resulting standoff, featuring an apoplectic collector, a confused populace, and at least 2 farmers brandishing rakes, finally convinced the nobility that perhaps heralds served some purpose after all. Negotiations were brief and one-sided. The Earl's chamberlain met with Alistair in the woods, took one look at the assembled heralds, who had by this point fashioned crude crowns from discarded announcements and declared themselves the Republic of Proclamation, and immediately agreed to every demand except the one about hazard pay for turnip-related injuries. When the heralds returned to work the next morning, the villagers greeted them with something approaching relief. Even the children's mocking rhymes sounded half-hearted. Alistair, standing once more in his accustomed spot near the well, unrolled the backlog of announcements with a theatrical flourish. "By order of his lordship," he began, then paused dramatically. "All previously announced taxes are hereby suspended until, this part smudged, let's say next week." The crowd erupted in cheers. The Earl, when informed of this creative interpretation, nearly choked on his breakfast. But a lesson had been learned, one written in no official record but understood by all. A village could survive bad news, but no news at all was simply unbearable. From that day forward, Heralds worked with a new spring in their step, and, in some cases, lightly armored padding under their tunics. The Earl's decrees became noticeably shorter and less frequent, and though the occasional rotten tomato still flew, it was now accompanied by laughter rather than genuine malice. As for Alistair, he took to keeping a small folded piece of parchment in his pocket at all times, a reminder of those strange, quiet days when the world had briefly operated without announcements. On it, he'd written just 3 words: "Silence is expensive." Chapter 9. The Herald's Wardrobe: Fashion or Function? The first thing any newly appointed herald learned was that the uniform would be his worst enemy. Not because it was uncomfortable, though it invariably was, nor because it was ridiculous, though that too was a given, but because it had been carefully designed over centuries to serve one cruel purpose: to make its wearer the most visible, targetable figure in any village square. Wixbury's heraldic garb had evolved through generations of bureaucratic malice and practical jokes disguised as tradition. The current iteration consisted of a tabard so violently crimson it made the eyes water, embroidered with the Earl's crest in gold thread so stiff it could probably stop a dagger thrust. The sleeves puffed out like overgrown mushrooms, ensuring the wearer couldn't lift his arms above shoulder height without risking entanglement. The hat, God, the hat, stood nearly 3 feet tall, a monstrosity of felt and feathers that caught every breeze like a ship's sail and required special training to keep from toppling over during important announcements. Alistair, upon receiving his uniform, had stared at it for a full minute before asking the quartermaster if this was some sort of punishment. The man had chuckled and clapped him on the shoulder with enough force to dislodge 3 buttons. "You'll grow into it," he'd said, as if the garment were a living thing that might eventually accept its wearer. The true genius of heraldic fashion lay in its carefully engineered impracticality. The colors were always bright enough to be spotted from any corner of the village, useful for ensuring no one missed an announcement, disastrous when trying to escape an angry mob. The fabrics were uniformly non-absorbent, the better to show off any thrown liquids in their full glory. Every element served to separate the herald from the common folk, marking him as simultaneously above them in status, and beneath them in everyone's estimation. Historical records suggested the tradition began innocently enough. Early heralds had worn simple sashes to denote their office, something to set them apart from regular citizens when making proclamations. But as the years passed and rulers grew more creative with unpopular decrees, the costumes grew more elaborate, not out of any sense of pageantry, but as a form of preemptive blame deflection. A peasant might hesitate before pelting his neighbor with rotten fruit, but a man dressed like a rejected playing card, that was practically an invitation. The hat alone deserved its own chronicle. Towering, unwieldy, and utterly devoid of practical purpose, it had been introduced during the reign of Earl Baldric the Ostentatious, a man who believed headwear should be visible from neighboring counties. The original design had allegedly included actual small bells, until the first test subject developed permanent neck damage from the weight. Modern versions were only slightly less hazardous, serving primarily as excellent rain collectors and bird roosts. Alistair had learned early on to remove his before entering any building with door frames lower than 8 feet, a lesson reinforced by 3 concussions in as many weeks. Footwear represented another masterclass in medieval cruelty. Herald's boots rose nearly to the knee, made of leather so stiff it squeaked with every step. The soles were deliberately thin, the better to feel the cobbles, as one particularly sadistic quartermaster had put it, which in practice meant feeling every stone, every puddle, and every piece of broken pottery a village had to offer. Breaking them in required a process not unlike torture, involving weeks of blisters, muttered curses, and the occasional tears shed into one's ale. The only advantage they offered was a slight protection against being stepped on during riots, though this was offset by making quick escapes nearly impossible. Accessories completed this sartorial nightmare. A ceremonial chain of office heavy enough to anchor small fishing vessels. gloves so ornate they rendered manual tasks impossible, and in winter so thin they might as well have been made of parchment. A belt pouch just large enough to hold one scroll and absolutely nothing else, ensuring the Herald had to make separate trips for every announcement rather than batching bad news together. The psychological impact of the uniform should not be underestimated. Wearing it transformed even the meekest soul into a figure of ridicule and scorn. Children pointed and laughed. Dogs barked. Grown men and women who had known Alistair since childhood suddenly found themselves unable to look him in the eye without smirking. The clothes didn't just mark him as the messenger. They marked him as the acceptable target, the living embodiment of every unpopular decision made by his betters. This was, of course, precisely the point. Seasoned heralds developed coping mechanisms. Some embraced the absurdity, adding their own flourishes to the already ridiculous outfits. Extra ribbons, particularly ostentatious feathers, once even a set of functioning wind chimes, sewn into the hem. Others went the opposite route, wearing their uniforms with such dignity that the contrast between the man and his costume became its own statement. Alistair fell somewhere in between, settling for subtle acts of defiance like leaving the top button permanently unfastened, and occasionally forgetting his hat when making particularly unpleasant announcements. The true test came during inclement weather. Rain turned the heavy wool into a sodden prison. Snow collected in every fold and crevice, until the Herald resembled a walking drift. High winds transformed the hat into a personal weather vane, often leaving its wearer spinning like a top. Through it all, the Herald was expected to maintain his dignity and volume, a task roughly equivalent to reciting Shakespeare while being attacked by geese. Perhaps the cruelest twist was the cleaning regimen. The uniforms couldn't simply be washed like normal clothing. Oh no. They required special handling, special soaps, special prayers to whatever deity oversaw fabric preservation. Blood stains from thrown rocks were one thing, but beet juice? That required a full day of soaking, and the sacrifice of at least one good scrubbing brush. Alistair had once spent an entire afternoon trying to remove egg yolk from his left sleeve, only to discover the stain had somehow migrated to his right elbow. And yet, for all its faults, the uniform served its primary function flawlessly. No one ever mistook a herald for anything else. No one ever forgot who delivered the bad news. And no one, absolutely no one, ever blamed the Earl when they could blame the idiot dressed like a rejected jester instead. As Alistair stood in the square one particularly windy morning, struggling to keep his hat from becoming airborne while announcing new restrictions on ale consumption, it occurred to him that the true purpose of heraldic fashion wasn't to identify the messenger. It was to make sure everyone remembered exactly who not to listen to. The hat chose that moment to take flight, soaring over the crowd like some bizarre heraldic bird of prey before landing in the duck pond. The villagers laughed. Alistair sighed. Somewhere in his castle, the Earl undoubtedly chuckled at another job well done. Chapter 10. The shortest career in history. The village of Wixbury had seen its fair share of heralds come and go, but none departed quite so spectacularly as Peter of Milford, whose entire tenure lasted precisely one announcement. The poor man had arrived on a crisp autumn morning, bright-eyed and alarmingly optimistic for someone about to become the village's most hated figure. His uniform still smelled of the dye vat, his ceremonial horn still gleamed with factory polish, and he marched to the town square with the confidence of a man who had not yet learned what turnips felt like at terminal velocity. His first and only proclamation concerned the Earl's new window tax, a particularly inspired bit of revenue generation that counted every opening in a home larger than a loaf of bread. Peter delivered the news with perfect diction and what he probably imagined was reassuring eye contact. The villagers absorbed this information in stunned silence for approximately 3 heartbeats before the first cabbage left someone's hand. What followed was not so much a riot as a coordinated expulsion. The baker's wife led the charge with a rolling pin. The blacksmith's apprentice provided covering fire with a volley of rotten apples. And old Widow Clemens, who up until that moment had been considered the village's sweetest resident, demonstrated shocking accuracy with a bucket of chicken feet. Peter made it exactly 4 paces before losing his hat, 7 before tripping over his own ceremonial sash, and 11 before vaulting the mill race in a single bound that would have impressed the Earl's champion hurdler. He was last seen sprinting toward the forest with what remained of his dignity flapping behind him like a battle standard. The uniform was found 2 days later, folded neatly beside the road to Ipswich, the horn placed carefully atop it like a grave marker. Peter's record stood for nearly a decade until young Thomas the diminutive, so called because he stood barely 5 feet tall in thick-soled boots, attempted the job. Thomas lasted marginally longer, through 3 whole announcements, before an unfortunate incident involving the Earl's new beard tax and the village's unusually hirsute population. The ensuing chase culminated in Thomas being treed by no fewer than 7 bearded women and a particularly angry goat. He resigned by shouting his notice from an oak branch, then took up sheep herding, a profession where the animals might butt him but at least didn't hold grudges. The true master of abbreviated tenures, however, was undoubtedly Brother Anselm, a defrocked monk who took the herald position as penance. His first day coincided with announcements about increased tithes, a ban on gambling, and new restrictions on ale strength. Brother Anselm barely made it through the first sentence before the crowd turned ugly. What he lacked in speed he made up for in creativity, barricading himself in the church confessional for 3 hours, while villagers took turns shouting obscenities through the screen. When finally coaxed out with promises of safe passage, he immediately joined a passing group of traveling actors, claiming the theater was far less dangerous than civic service. Some resignations were quieter, but no less decisive. Maud at the fair lasted exactly 1 afternoon before realizing the uniform's hat made her look like an ambulatory mushroom. She left it perched on the village well with a note reading, "Find someone uglier." Harold the stutterer managed half a day before an unfortunate incident involving the phrase "PP plague precautions" and a panicked stampede that destroyed 3 market stalls. He was last seen boarding a river barge while practicing saying, "I'm a tinker," in increasingly confident tones. Children made particularly poor heralds, though this didn't stop the Earl's chamberlain from occasionally trying them out when adult candidates grew scarce. 10-year-old Jemmy lasted precisely as long as it took to announce a new candy tax before bursting into tears and giving away his own sweet stash as reparations. His slightly older cousin Will fared better, managing 2 full announcements before using his position to settle a playground grudge by falsely declaring the schoolmaster's house officially haunted by order of the Earl. The resulting chaos saw Will switching careers to puppetry, where his talent for fabrication was more appreciated. Then there were the heralds who never even made it to their first proclamation. Poor dim Gregory got as far as donning the uniform before catching sight of himself in a rain barrel and fleeing in terror at the court jester ghost he believed was chasing him. Nervous Nell abandoned her post upon seeing the size of the crowd, claiming sudden blindness. And one particularly unfortunate soul, whose name has been lost to history, took one look at the announcement scroll, which happened to contain news of an impending tax on left-handed people, and immediately joined a passing group of pilgrims bound for Jerusalem. The village blacksmith kept a running tally of these abbreviated careers on the side of his forge, each mark representing another soul broken by civic duty. The current record stood at 19 minutes, held jointly by twin brothers who had the poor timing to announce both a milk tax and a new ban on public whistling simultaneously. Their synchronized dive into the mill pond remained the stuff of local legend. What all these short-lived heralds shared was a fundamental misunderstanding of the job's true nature. They imagined themselves as respected messengers, as vital cogs in the machinery of governance. What they became were living shields, human sacrifices to the gods of bureaucracy. The smart ones learned quickly. The lucky ones escaped with minimal bruising. The rest became cautionary tales told to new recruits over pints of suspiciously weak ale. As for Alistair, he'd lasted longer than most by developing what he called strategic deafness, the ability to ignore both the content of announcements and the subsequent outrage with equal detachment. But even he kept a packed satchel hidden under his bed, just in case the villagers ever discovered exactly who had suggested the infamous goose tax of 8. Some careers weren't meant to last, and heralding, as Wixbury had proven time and again, was foremost among them. The position remained open more often than not, the uniform growing musty between wearings, the horn tarnishing from disuse. Villagers would sometimes pause by the empty announcement post, half expecting some new unfortunate to appear, then go about their day with quiet relief when none did. Bad news always arrived eventually, but in those brief, heraldless intervals, Wixbury allowed itself to imagine a world where no one needed to be blamed for its delivery. Then the Earl would dream up some new folly, the call would go out for another willing victim, and the cycle would begin anew. Someone always answered. There were always more fools, and Wixbury's ducks, at least, always needed more target practice. Chapter 11. The Herald's Last Words. Death came for Wixbury's heralds in creative ways, but it always arrived with impeccable comedic timing. Take poor old Gerald, who spent 15 years dodging produce only to choke on an apple core while announcing new fruit inspection protocol. Or young Matilda, who tragically drowned in the duck pond after announcing water rationing, an irony so perfect the villagers briefly considered it divine intervention. The cemetery's Herald's Row told the story in weathered stone. There lay Harold the Brief, whose epitaph read he meant well, followed immediately by the much larger tomb of Oswald Aloud, which bore the simple truth: they heard him. Between them rested tiny Agnes of the Brook, her marker carved with "She should have run faster," a lesson for all future criers. Some final words became local legend. Bartholomew the Unfortunate's last utterance: "The Earl decrees this meat tax shall." Remained etched in village memory, as did poor Willem's gasped, "I don't even agree with this proclamation," before the millstone hit him. These weren't so much dying words as occupational hazards given voice. The darkest humor belonged to those who saw it coming. Veteran Herald Alrik, upon being handed a scroll announcing the new death notification fee, reportedly sighed and asked, "Do I get the family discount?" before proceeding to read himself into an early grave. Similarly, when plague struck in 1348, Harold Geoffrey famously prefaced his announcement with, "Well, this one's for me too," before listing the symptoms in disturbingly accurate detail. Not all heralds went quietly. Big Tom reportedly took 6 villagers with him during the Great El Riot of 22, his final act being to hurl the offending tax scroll like a javelin through the Reeves window. Marjorie the Stern allegedly expired mid-curse during the sheep census rebellion, her last words being an inventive suggestion about where the Earl could stick his counting stick. The church refused to bury heralds in consecrated ground for centuries following the incident of the cursing corpse, wherein a particularly unpopular messenger's body allegedly sat up during his funeral to deliver one final obscenity before collapsing into dust. Now they rested in a special plot near the tannery, where the smell kept both mourners and grave robbers away. Children played a macabre game using the herald stones, assigning points for creativity in both epitaphs and theorized demises. Old man Derricksy died as he lived, loudly and with poor timing, scored higher than simple killed by mob, though both lost to the legendary "Here lies Peter. Oh God, not the bees." No one could confirm the bee story, but it stayed in rotation regardless. Newly appointed heralds were traditionally taken on a tour of this grim gallery, their first week, a practice meant to either build resilience or encourage immediate resignation. Current Herald Alistair remembered his guide cheerfully pointing out each stone's backstory, while casually mentioning which villagers had done the killing. This one got the blacksmith's hammer. That one took a cider barrel to the head. Oh, and little Alice here holds our record for fastest turnaround, announced her own death warrant by accident, and promptly fell down this very well. The most poignant memorial stood apart from the others, a small, unassuming marker reading Stephen. He tried to warn us. No one remembered which disaster Stephen had predicted, only that they'd pelted him with turnips for his trouble. Now, during hard times, villagers would sometimes leave a single turnip atop the stone, a quiet apology 2 centuries too late. Alistair often wandered the Heralds' row, when contemplating resignation, reading the stones like cautionary verses. Some days he'd pause at fresh graves, noting how the causes of death grew more creative with each generation. The newest addition belonged to poor dim Roger, whose marker stated simply he forgot to duck, beneath which some wag had scratched also to breathe. What no epitaph captured was the strange pride that came with the job. However brief or brutal their tenure, each herald had stood in that square and spoken truth to power, even if that truth was the Earl wants your sheep. They'd taken the blows meant for others, funneled the rage of hundreds into their solitary frames. That had to count for something, even if the only commemoration was a weathered stone and the occasional nostalgic drunk urinating on it. As Alistair traced the name on the oldest readable marker, Anselm, God finally listened. He wondered what his own stone would say. He lasted longer than most, fell heroically defending his hat. Or perhaps just the traditional herald's farewell. I was just the messenger. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sounds of the village preparing for another day of grievances and grudges. Somewhere, the Earl was doubtless drafting another unpopular decree. Somewhere, a farmer was selecting the perfect rotten pumpkin. And when the time came, someone would have to stand in that square and bridge the gap between them. Alistair adjusted his ridiculous hat and turned back toward town. The dead heralds could rest. The living still had work to do. Chapter 12. The Evolution of Bad News Delivery. The first signs of change came quietly, almost politely, like a tax collector knocking rather than kicking down the door. A printed notice appeared one morning on the church door, its crisp letters proclaiming a new curfew with none of the usual dramatic flair. The villagers gathered around it, poking at the paper like it might bite, waiting for some poor herald to emerge and take responsibility for the words. None came. The notice simply was, impersonal and untouchable, like the weather or the plague. This was the beginning of the end for Wixbury's heralds, though no one realized it at the time. The printing press had slithered its way into the county seat, and with it came the revolutionary idea that bad news could be delivered without a human target attached. At first the changes were small, the occasional royal decree distributed on parchment instead of shouted, market regulations nailed to posts rather than proclaimed. But each scrap of paper was a tiny nail in the herald's coffin, a silent usurper of their ancient thankless duty. Alistair noticed a difference in the quality of produce thrown. Where once villagers had saved their truly rotten vegetables for live announcements, now they grew careless, hurling merely overripe tomatoes at printed notices. The anger lacked focus. The rage no longer had a face to direct itself toward. Part of him missed the honest hostility of the old days, when at least the hatred had been personal. The Earl, never one to miss an opportunity to combine pettiness with innovation, developed a particular fondness for the new methods. Where once he'd hesitated to impose truly outrageous decrees for fear of losing good heralds, now he unleashed them with abandon. Let them tear up the paper, he chuckled to his chamberlain after authorizing the infamous left sock tax. It's cheaper than replacing criers. Some heralds tried adapting. Young Jeremy, who'd only held the position for 3 months, took to standing beside posted notices and dramatically reading them aloud, hoping to recapture some of the old magic. The villagers ignored him, reserving their contempt for the notices themselves, which they defaced with increasingly creative graffiti. One particularly artistic soul drew a remarkably accurate caricature of the Earl on a tax notice, complete with arrows pointing to various body parts labeled greedy and small. The older heralds saw the writing on the wall, quite literally, as more and more announcements appeared painted on boards and hung in the square. Their once proud uniforms began gathering dust, their ceremonial horns tarnished from disuse. A few tried branching out into related professions: town gossip, wedding announcer, professional witness, but it wasn't the same. Without the threat of violence, the job lost its peculiar dignity. Alistair lasted longer than most, if only because certain announcements still required official proclamation. Births, deaths, and the occasional royal visit demanded the human touch, though even these were increasingly handled via posted lists. His final official duty came on a damp Tuesday, announcing the Earl's newest tax on rainfall collection. A dozen villagers showed up, more out of habit than interest, their vegetable pouches noticeably understocked. The moment lacked ceremony, the anger perfunctory. When a single limp cabbage leaf flopped at his feet, Alistair knew it was over. The transition wasn't immediate. For years, old habits persisted alongside new technologies. Some villagers still glanced toward the announcement post at midday, half expecting a colorful figure to appear. Children occasionally pelted postal carriers out of force of habit, much to the confusion of everyone involved. The Earl, in a rare fit of nostalgia, tried reviving the herald position for traditional holidays, but the spectacle had lost its edge. A man in a funny hat shouting about harvest festivals couldn't compete with the sheer volume of printed grievances now flowing through the village. What truly killed the heralds wasn't the printing press, nor even the Earl's frugality. It was the simple fact that people had found safer targets for their anger. They could curse at papers, deface notices, even burn effigies without risking actual bloodshed. The system had evolved beyond needing human lightning rods, and the heralds, for all their skill and suffering, had become relics. Alistair visited the Herald's Row one last time before leaving Wixbury, running his fingers over the weathered stones. They marked more than graves. They marked the end of an era where bearing bad news was an art form, where a man could measure his worth in bruises and produce related injuries. The new world was cleaner, safer, and infinitely more boring. As he turned to go, a printed notice fluttered down from the church wall, landing at his feet like a final insult. He picked it up, smoothed its creases, and for old time's sake read it aloud to the empty square. No one threw anything. No one even noticed. The words hung in the air, then faded, as meaningless as the wind. The heralds were gone. The news would continue without them. Chapter 13. Modern-day heralds. Who bears the bad news now? The spirit of Wixbury's heralds never truly died. It simply evolved, shedding its ridiculous hat and ceremonial sash for new uniforms, equally designed to absorb public fury. The modern world might have traded town squares for call centers and parchment scrolls for email blasts, but humanity's need to shoot the messenger remained stubbornly unchanged. Consider the customer service representative, that beleaguered soul whose headset cord might as well be a noose. Where medieval heralds faced the occasional rotten tomato, these modern martyrs endure hour upon hour of disembodied rage funneled directly into their eardrums. The vocabulary has changed. No one threatens to pelt a Comcast employee with turnips, however tempting. But the underlying dynamic remains eerily familiar. Somewhere in the afterlife, old Herald Alistair watches with grim recognition as another minimum-wage worker explains for the 12th time that no, the company cannot refund 10 years of service fees just because the customer only now decided to read their bill. Journalists inherited another piece of the Herald's cursed legacy. Where once villagers blamed the messenger for the Earl's latest tax hike, now comment sections explode with fury at reporters who dare to document unpleasant truths. The vegetables may be metaphorical now, but they fly just as fast and with comparable accuracy. A particularly masochistic medieval herald might have lasted 3 announcements before fleeing into the forest. Modern journalists last slightly longer, but develop the same haunted look around month 6. Human resources professionals became the unwilling heralds of the corporate world, tasked with announcing layoffs in carefully worded emails that somehow make "we're eliminating your position" sound like we're offering you an exciting new opportunity in unemployment. They've perfected the art of the strategic retreat, delivering bad news from behind layers of policy and legalese that would make even the most evasive medieval scribe nod in admiration. That their offices are usually placed near emergency exits suggests institutional memory runs deeper than anyone admits. Technical support teams channel the most inventive heralds of old, those who learned to couch terrible news in layers of soothing nonsense. "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" is just the modern equivalent of "His Lordship kindly requests your voluntary contribution to the Crown's coffers." Both phrases translating roughly to "I can't actually help you, but let's pretend this ritual does something." The parallels grow stronger when considering how often both medieval peasants and modern users ignore perfectly good advice before angrily demanding miracles. Tax collectors, ironically, became both the message and the messengers, a duality that would have broken the brain of even the most philosophical Wixbury herald. Where once they hid safely behind castle walls, while heralds took the brunt of public anger, now they deliver their own bad news via ominously thick envelopes. The vegetables may have been replaced by audit notices, but the resulting heartburn remains remarkably similar. Even modern apps have taken up the herald's mantle. Where once a man in a silly hat would announce the latest price increases, now push notifications perform the same function with unsettling cheer. Good news! Your subscription service is now 30% more valuable and also 30% more expensive. The lack of a human target doesn't stop users from cursing at their screens, just as villagers once cursed at the wind after particularly unfair proclamations. The medical profession unexpectedly became heirs to the most painful heraldic duty, delivering news no one wants to hear. Doctors delivering terminal diagnoses, insurance clerks explaining coverage gaps, pharmacists listing side effects, all walk in the footsteps of those long-ago heralds who announced plagues and famines. The stakes are higher now, the consequences more severe, but the essential dynamic remains. Someone must speak the unbearable aloud, and someone else must bear the resulting anguish. Social media managers may be the purest spiritual descendants of medieval heralds, professionally tasked with announcing unpopular changes to digital fiefdoms. The platforms changed, but the cycle didn't. Facebook's equivalent of "the Earl demands your sheep" might be "we're changing the algorithm again," but the resulting outrage follows the same ancient patterns. Keyboard warriors replace pitchfork-wielding peasants. Downvote arrows substitute for thrown cabbages. But the human impulse remains constant. Find the nearest available target and vent. Yet for all these modern equivalents, something fundamental has been lost. The heralds of Wixbury, for all their suffering, had stood physically present to absorb society's anger. Their bruises and battered pride formed a tangible release valve for communal frustration. Today's messengers are insulated by screens and distance, their suffering reduced to metrics, call times, click rates, customer satisfaction scores. The rage still flows, but without a human face to direct it toward, it curdles into something colder and more diffuse. Perhaps this explains the strange nostalgia some feel for those ridiculous figures in their pompous uniforms. However cruel the system was, at least it was honest about its cruelty. When a herald announced your taxes were doubling, you knew exactly whom to blame and how hard to throw the pumpkin. Modern life offers no such catharsis, just endless layers of automated responses and corporate speak that leave frustration with nowhere to go but inward. Alistair, had he lived to see this age, might have pitied these digital age heralds. At least his suffering had been immediate, finite, and followed by the occasional free drink from sympathetic bartenders. Who buys around for an overwhelmed call center worker? Who toasts the journalist who delivered bad news fairly? The vegetables may have stopped flying, but in some ways that only made the whole business sadder. The last of Wicksbury's Herald's stone still stands in that overgrown cemetery, its inscription weathered but legible. He told the truth and paid the price. Modern messengers might not risk physical violence anymore, but in 1,000 quiet ways, burn out cynicism, that particular exhaustion that comes from endless deflection. The price remains. The methods evolve, the words change, but the essential truth doesn't. Someone always has to bear the bad news, and someone else will always make them regret it. The heralds are gone. Long live the heralds. Chapter 14. Lessons from the Herald's Tale. The heralds of Wicksbury may be long gone, their ridiculous hats moth-eaten relics, and their once mighty voices reduced to whispers in forgotten graves. But their legacy lingers like the stubborn stench of week-old fish in the marketplace. Their lives, short, brutish, and perpetually pelted with root vegetables, offered invaluable lessons for those willing to listen, which, historically speaking, no one ever was. Lesson 1. All bad news sounds better in Latin. The smarter heralds quickly realized that wrapping unpleasant truths in fancy language could soften the blow, if only slightly. The Earl demands your grain became by decree of his most noble lordship. A voluntary contribution of cereal goods is humbly requested for the betterment of the realm. Villagers still hated it, but their confusion bought the herald precious seconds to escape. Modern politicians and corporate spokespeople have refined this tactic into an art form, turning layoffs into right-sizing and taxes into revenue enhancements. The principle remains unchanged. If you must ruin someone's day, at least do it with proper syntax. Lesson 2. Never stand downwind of an angry butcher. Geography mattered almost as much as diction when delivering bad news. Position yourself near escape routes, avoid dead-end alleys, and for the love of all that is holy, never trap yourself between an incensed mob and the tannery. The stench alone could fell a weaker man. Modern parallels exist. Customer service reps know never to answer the phone while standing near flammable objects, and journalists learn which neighborhoods require a quick getaway car. Lesson 3. If you must be hated, at least be memorable. The heralds who survived longest were the ones who embraced their role as communal punching bags with flair. A well-timed joke, a dramatic flourish of the scroll, or even an exaggerated collapse after a particularly solid turnip strike could turn rage into reluctant admiration. Today's unfortunate messengers, perhaps its support, anyone who's ever said the wife is down, could learn from this. A little showmanship makes the medicine go down easier, even if the medicine is your insurance doesn't cover that or we're out of sourdough. Lesson 4. The truth doesn't set you free. It gets you chased into a river. Wicksbury's heralds learned the hard way that honesty was rarely rewarded. The few who tried to soften the Earl's decrees were fired. The fewer who tried to protest them were fired, hinti the nearest body of water. The lesson? No one actually wants the truth. They just want someone to blame for it. Modern messengers, from whistleblowers to bloggers, rediscover this daily. The more things change, the more people still really and they hate the bearer of bad news. Lesson 5. Always keep spare undergarments nearby. A practical tip, but a vital one. Whether fleeing an angry mob, sweating through a plague announcement, or simply caught in unexpected rain, a change of clothes could mean the difference between discomfort and utter misery. Modern equivalents abound. Tech support keeps spare coffee mugs for desk-flipping moments, journalists learn to pack snacks for interminable press conferences, and customer service reps stock spare headsets for when the first one gets thrown. Lesson 6. The more unreasonable the decree, the faster you should run. Heralds developed an instinct for which announcements would provoke immediate violence versus grudging acceptance. The Earl requests your presence at the spring festival might earn eye rolls. The Earl has declared Tuesday illegal, demanded immediate sprinting. Today's messengers, whether explaining a new parking fee or why the office microwave smells like burnt despair, must similarly gauge the volatility of their audience. Lesson 7. No one remembers the messenger, only the message. For all their suffering, heralds were ultimately forgettable. Villagers recalled the injustices, the taxes, the idiotic laws, but never the poor soul who delivered the news. Modern messengers can take cold comfort in this. Your suffering is temporary, but the collective outrage will move on to the next target soon enough. Lesson 8. Sometimes silence is the loudest statement. The most effective protest Wixbury's heralds ever staged wasn't a riot or a petition. It was the day they simply didn't show up. The villagers, so accustomed to having someone to shout at, were left yelling at walls and notices, their fury echoing uselessly. Even today, the most powerful rebuke a messenger can make is to step aside and let the message speak, or fail to speak, for itself. And so as the sun sets on Wixbury Square, now quiet, its announcement post sagging with age, the final lesson lingers like the ghost of a long-dead herald. Someone will always have to bear the bad news. It might as well be you. Just make sure to duck.